The night the fire came, it didn't roar at first. It whispered. It moved quietly through the dry grass, crawling like a secret no one wanted to admit was real. By the time anyone saw the glow on the horizon, it was already too late. The sky over the small Australian town of Glenrower turned a violent shade of orange, as if the world itself had been set ablaze. And standing on the edge of that town, watching the flames rise like a judgment he couldn't escape, was a man who had already lost everything long before the fire arrived. Ethan Cole hadn't always been a broken man. There was a time when people used to smile when they saw him walking down the dusty road, his boots kicking up soft clouds of earth, his laughter easy and warm. He had a small farm just outside town, a modest life, and a family that made everything feel complete. His wife, Clara, had a way of bringing light into even the darkest corners of his mind, and his young son, Noah, had inherited her smile, the kind that made you believe in second chances. But life has a cruel way of shifting without warning. It started with the drought. Month after month, the land dried up beneath Ethan's feet. Crops failed, debts grew, and the pressure wrapped around his chest like a tightening rope. The man who once found peace in the quiet rhythm of farm life began to unravel. His patience thinned. His temper grew sharp. The laughter faded. Clara tried to hold everything together. She stood beside him through every hardship, speaking softly when he shouted, holding his hand even when he pulled away. But there are some storms love alone cannot calm. One night, after a long day of nothing going right, Ethan let his frustration turn into something darker. Words were said, words that couldn't be taken back. Clara's eyes filled with tears, not just from the argument, but from something deeper, something breaking. Noah watched from the doorway, silent and afraid, as the man he admired became someone he didn't recognize. By morning, Clara and Noah were gone. They left a note. It was simple, gentle, and devastating. She wrote that she needed to protect their son from the anger that had taken over their home. She wrote that she still loved him, but she couldn't stay. That was the moment Ethan truly lost everything. Months turned into years, and the silence of the farmhouse became unbearable. The land that once gave him purpose now felt like a prison. He stopped taking care of it. Stopped taking care of himself. The man who once stood tall became a shadow, drifting through each day without direction. The town moved on, as towns always do. People whispered about him at first, then slowly forgot. Ethan became just another cautionary tale, someone who had everything and let it slip through his fingers. And then, the fire came. It started miles away, sparked by lightning in the dry wilderness. But the wind carried it fast, feeding the flames with everything in its path. By the time the alarms sounded in Glenrower, the fire had grown into something unstoppable. Ethan saw the smoke before he heard the sirens. At first, he didn't move. He stood on his porch, staring at the horizon as if it were a distant memory. There was a strange calm in his chest, a quiet acceptance. Maybe this was how it was supposed to end. Maybe this was his punishment. But then he heard something that broke through the numbness. A child crying. It came from the neighboring property, a small house owned by an elderly couple who had recently taken in their granddaughter. Ethan hadn't spoken to them in months, but the sound of that child's fear cut through him like a blade. For a moment, he hesitated. And in that moment, the man he used to be, the one Clara had loved, the one Noah had looked up to, flickered back to life. Before he could talk himself out of it, Ethan ran. The heat was already intense, the air thick with smoke that clawed at his lungs. Ash fell like dark snow, settling on his skin, his clothes, his hair. The world around him felt unreal, like a nightmare he couldn't wake from. When he reached the house, flames were already licking at the edges of the property. He kicked the door open without thinking. Inside, chaos. The elderly couple were struggling to gather their things, panic etched into every movement. The little girl stood in the corner, tears streaming down her face, frozen with fear. Ethan didn't waste time. He moved with a purpose he hadn't felt in years, grabbing the girl and urging the couple toward the back exit. His voice was steady, firm, so different from the anger that once defined him. Outside, the fire had grown closer. The path to safety was narrowing. Ethan led them through the smoke, shielding the girl with his body, guiding the couple step by step. Every breath burned. Every second felt like it might be the last. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. Because for the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about his own pain. He was thinking about someone else. They reached the main road just as emergency crews arrived. The couple collapsed into the arms of the firefighters, overwhelmed with relief. The little girl clung to Ethan, her small hands gripping his shirt as if letting go meant losing everything. And in that moment, something inside him shifted. Something healed. But the night wasn't over. As Ethan turned to leave, a firefighter shouted that another house further down was still occupied. The flames had already surrounded it. Without hesitation, Ethan ran again. This time, the fire fought back harder. The heat was unbearable, the smoke blinding. The house was nearly engulfed when he reached it. Every instinct told him to turn back. But he didn't. He forced his way inside, calling out, his voice hoarse and desperate. And then he heard it, a faint reply from somewhere deeper in the house. He followed the sound, pushing through the choking darkness, until he found a man trapped beneath a fallen beam. There was no time to think. Only to act. Ethan used every ounce of strength he had left to lift the beam, ignoring the pain, the heat, the fear. The man crawled free, coughing, barely conscious. Together, they stumbled toward the exit. The fire roared around them, closing in. For a moment, it seemed impossible. And then, just as the flames reached their peak, they burst through the door into the open air. They collapsed on the ground, gasping for breath, alive. The fire would eventually be contained. The damage would be immense. Homes lost. Lives changed forever. But something else had happened that night. Something far more powerful. Ethan Cole, the man who had spent years drowning in regret, had found his way back. Not through words, but through action. In the days that followed, the town of Glenrower saw him differently. Not as the man who lost everything, but as the man who risked everything to save others. And slowly, quietly, Ethan began to rebuild. Not just his farm, but his life. Months later, as the land began to heal, a familiar car pulled up to the edge of his property. Ethan stood frozen as Clara stepped out, Noah beside her. Time seemed to stand still. There were no grand speeches, no perfect words. Just a long, silent moment filled with everything that had been broken, and everything that might still be mended. Ethan walked toward them, his heart pounding, his past heavy on his shoulders. But this time, he didn't carry it alone. Because redemption isn't about erasing what you've done. It's about choosing who you become next.